Blessings and welcome back to our 34th episode in our journey through the zodiacal faces. I'm astrologer Elsa Wadsworth, and I'm joined today again by brilliant astrologers David Fisher and Katie Dayton. We are here for Pisces I. I can hardly believe we are at Pisces. 2 more decans to go, our final sign in our Decanic walk. It's kind of sad. Like, I've been having so much fun doing this with you all. So, of course, it's emotional, like Pisces would be. If you're joining in 2022, well, it's 2023 now, but 2022, 2023, you're joining live as we move through the sun's passage of each Decanic face. And to all of you watching in the future, thank you so much for tuning in to our Decanic invocation and tribute. Drop a comment below and let us know you're here and where you're tuning in from, which is something we'd love to hear from you. So let's go ahead and get started. We're now in Jupiter world, right? Jupiter, Pisces, the ruler of Pisces. So we've got the Jupiter card, which is the Wheel of Fortune, which we're not going to be focusing super deeply on this time because we've got the moon card representing the Pisces. So that being called the ruler of flux and reflux. So that's our Pisces card, the moon card, which is super exciting to cover in these decans. And then we've got the universe card representing Saturn as the co-lord for this decan. So back to our universe card. And one thing I want to draw to people's attention here is that we have been working with Saturn very strongly for the last 2 signs, so 6 decans. Saturn has ruled as Baphomet or the devil through Capricorn season and has been ruling as the star card through Aquarius season. Well, now we've got Saturn kind of making its entrance out of being, the star of the show, but it's the Decanic lord for the next decan, the co-ruler. So it's kind of a small drift off, but we're going to see it for the last time in our Decanic walk in this decan as the co-ruler to Jupiter. Again, that card being called the Great One of the Night of Time.
I wanted to say about the Saturn Decanic rulership of this decan. In her chapter in 36 Secrets, Chang talks about, I think, an interesting dichotomy between what the sign ruler and the Decanic ruler will bring to a decan. And in this case, the equivalent being, it's been Saturn's realms the last 2 decans, but this is what we see when we take Saturn's gifts on the road.
Yeah, I love that she said that, on the road, because, when we think about on the road, a lot of times we'll think about, Sagittarius as the traveler, but we get that from that Jupiterian aspect that we see here again in Pisces. And, on the road, in this case, Austin will talk a little bit about this, or we'll get to this when I sort of bring in some of the Austin Coppock quotes, but it's a very unknown realm. And again, very internalized. But this time, Saturn's focus or Saturn's lordship is in service to Jupiter. So where we see the great expanse of the unknown in the star or in the Aquarian themes, here we get this sense of the unknown, but brought in a Jupiterian way, which is this hopeful expanse. And again, we've got water. I guess I shouldn't say again, now we're moving from air into water, and water, or Jupiter's watery sign Pisces, is going to give it a much sort of deeper or like thicker kind of realm. You can think of like the vast unknown of the unexplored oceans, kind of that fear of the unknown that has to do with that oceanic wave, that deep blue, that extreme expanse where you sort of have to dive under.
It's very mystical, which is not something we maybe would first glance associate with Saturn, but it's a very mystical decan.
This would be the more feminine side of Jupiter, right? Or the more feminine expression of Jupiter would be more comfortable within this realm. And I feel like Jupiter wants to understand everything. It wants to experience everything. And as a water sign, Pisces is telling us that our bodies feel the need to integrate in some hopeful way or in some way that our minds can wrap themselves around things that are unintelligible for us. We need to make peace with them in our hearts in a subjective way, in an unconscious way, that we might even understand them consciously, but not be okay with some circumstance that's happening around us. And the other way around might be true, which is where Pisces is good at. But when you think about Saturn in this particular realm, and again, mutable waters, I think about the solvent, the dissolving quality of water. I think that with Saturn here, we really have those boundaries that were created, those concepts that were created through Capricorn and Aquarius, kind of being dissolved. Not dissolved because they are inappropriate, but because time itself, as Saturn learns here perhaps, or enacts in this particular phase, time ticks for those structures in particular as well, because they are also man-made. And I feel like if you look closely, there is this Saturnian quality to Pisces in a way, by being the last sign of the zodiac. I'm not associating it to the 12th house, but there is this kind of dissolution quality that is a little bit Saturnian, and that's where I think the commonality is, that we can find it within this deck, and that shines.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point. Like as Pisces is a sign, being a mutable water sign, being ruled by Jupiter, you do see themes of like hope carrying on. And it's not the same type of hope that we see in the star card, but you get, again, this, yes, disillusionment, or like everything had to happen to me for a reason, bad or good. You kind of get these like really glass half full kind of qualities in Pisces, or as like a, I guess, as a meme of Pisces. And I think we're going to see that a little bit more in the decans to come. Whereas in this first decan with Saturn, it's definitely sort of the initial, I guess, I don't want to say like shock or something, but the initial kind of like, whoa, I'm in over my head, or whoa, this disillusionment is like real, because we go to the boundaries of the unknown, and then we sort of can drown in what that means for us. And Saturn sort of, you know, where I want to tie it in, I guess, is we're going to be talking about the moon card. And if it seems a little, at least from my perspective, a little bleak or dim or something like that, I'm interpreting the moon card, that Pisces card, with that Saturn flavor this time, which I know for tarot readers, they're going to associate potentially, and not always, the moon card with maybe deceitfulness, or kind of like the changing of the faces and the phases of the moon. And again, you're going to get that coming strong with Saturn as being the sort of like, maybe not the Lord of Illusion, but the kind of feigned appearances, or the deceitful like nature. And it's not necessarily deceiving others. It can be very deceptive in the quality of our own interpretation. And I think that's where we're getting into those emotional waters, or those Jupiterian expansions that have that feminine, like watery quality, where it can feel, yeah, like overwhelm perhaps, or something. That can give a little bit of that like moon card darkness or deception or changing of faces.
I want to call back a little bit to what we were saying in Libra, with the moon and Venus being in rulership, for instance, of particular decan and sign being a diurnal element, you know, there. Here we have the opposite. We have two diurnal planets being in rulership of this particular part of the zodiac that is feminine in nature. And this, yes, Jupiter feels more comfortable in this particular place, but think about Jupiter retrograde, where you would feel like Jupiter doesn't know exactly, doesn't have the parameters, doesn't have the experience yet, but has to look at things kind of in a hopeful way. I feel like the circumstances described by this decan, and tying with what you're saying also, the deceitfulness of Saturn, would be like being hopeful while facing the fearsome realization that your expectations were a bit too high, or your expectations were a bit off, in a sense, and still learning how to be within circumstance and with how to find hope within those particular scenarios. And also learning how to also, because having so much experience with that, learning how to navigate that mystery of life so much. It's intuitively kind of connecting to your own depths, I think. Like you've faced it so often that you kind of become accustomed to going into the depths of things, in some way, in a positive note.
Yeah, and I mean, coming out of Aquarius, maybe we have learned the lessons of the expanse and like all of that, but it's like very mental. It's very like questioning the mind. It's very maybe even slightly more active. And we've seen that active part of Jupiter when we're in the fire sign of Sagittarius, where David makes a good point. We've got these day planets, and both Saturn and Jupiter have to do with like bigness and boundaries on some level. And now you're taking that into the nighttime, the feminine quality, a watery place that's already having to do with like the depths of emotion. It's not about the rationality of the whole thing. And so that's where you're looking at those like limits and boundaries of those day planets, that they like to have a little bit more tangible grasp, or a little more fire behind them, or a little more earth behind them. And then you're putting them in this sort of like watery depth. And you do get some of that illusion or disillusion, but kind of like, again, that hopeful or elemental water emotive character, I guess. So keeping that in mind.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah,
about the kind of basic meanings of the moon card, and we've kind of danced around this a little bit, and I think we're going to talk about it more when we get to the tarot cards. But the moon has a lot to do with the unconscious and with dreaming, which is also something very associated with the sign of Pisces. I believe like that Jupiter hopefulness is kind of what we're dancing around with the dreaming. But it's very Piscean, some of those keywords.
Yeah, and if
you were just like, sorry, you're just like, can I just say one more thing? And I was just like, perfect Steve Jobs quote.
Yes, Steve Jobs being a nativity here, which we have some cool nativities to give you all at the end.
We also will get to this more later on. One more thing. Just think about the way that the world looks in moonlight versus sunlight. And you really get the feeling for why the moon could be known as deceit. What hides in the shadows? What is lurking around the corner? Why does this place that I'm so familiar with look totally different in the moonlight than it does during the day?
Yeah, and that kind of dreaming or imaginative quality, it is very real here, because it's not necessarily a hope for the future. It's not necessarily something sturdy to build on, but it's like, if I can dream of it, or if I can be hopeful about it, or if I can imagine it, and you're kind of imagining and being hopeful in all this, not in the mind, in the emotive quality, where that's where we're dreaming. We're getting rid of a lot of those subconscious like ideas through the dreams. And again, with imagining, it's like, I can imagine a better place, so maybe I could be hopeful. Maybe there's something to build off of there, or, I can imagine a better emotional state, so maybe I can, hold that hope for it. Austin Coppock calls this the labyrinth. And I think that's really interesting, because a labyrinth, a lot of people think about as a maze, but what's different about a labyrinth is you are going through this maze, but only to get to the core. And you have to walk out the same way that you came in. And that's why people call it like a meditative quality, or people use labyrinths for sort of like sorting stuff out, or for doing like walking meditations and things like that, because you're going into the core, making a wish or leaving something there, or whatever it is, doing your prayer. And then from that core, you have to spiral your way back out to the entrance to get to that, to release yourself from the labyrinth. And I think there's really something there if you can kind of get to that emotionality of like what that would mean for you to go into the core of something and have to either release something there or take it back out with you, like however you want to look at that. But it's really, you're confused the whole time, right? Like you're touching the walls, you don't know how to get to the core, you make it to the core, you don't really remember your way back out, so you still have to sort of like find your way back out, and you're feeling through the darkness in this sense to get to like an emotional core, and then having to, you know, balance your way to get back out and bring it back out into the world. So, you know, I think just that journey of like moving into the core, not knowing, and then also really not knowing your way back out, and having that being like a meditative sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say trust fall, but something like that, where you're having to like navigate a space, like say Saturn, it'll keep to the task, right? It'll go all the way into the labyrinth, find the core, and bring you all the way back out. So it gives it that quality of like endurance, but it's completely in the emotional dark, or, you know, you're in the labyrinth under the moonlight type of a thing. So you don't
Again, planets that are masculine trying to bring definition and boundaries into a realm that is completely dissolving everything around you. So it's much more like, it's kind of a hermit state, really, that you have to go through to be able to deal with this particular energy. Not, what?
Guess what the opposite of Pisces is?
Yeah, no, I know. But it's interesting how the remedy for the energy is like dominating, for dealing with it, is like dominating the balance, the opposite of it sometimes, because you have to keep that hermit energy into perspective to be able to navigate this particular decan or this particular sign in general, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get it that it's the opposite, but that's what I'm saying. Like, this is not that. Just keeping that in mind will help you deal.
Yeah, and I think either it's in the Pythagorean or maybe even T. Susan, I'm forgetting at the moment, where they mention this like hermit dichotomy as like what you'll need, like the hangman versus the hermit, and the, you know, the kind of polarity that we see here.
Yeah, the quote is that the hermit asks the moon for her secrets, while the moon asks the hermit to forsake all that is familiar.
T. Susan Chang calls this the furthest shore, which I think is a beautiful kind of metaphor coming out of the skyscape, the furthest shore of the star or of Aquarius, that sort of like spatial space attitude that we have with the star, like looking up and going out into deep space and those furthest shores, as well as like now bringing that to where like the land and the water meet, that kind of like more nourishing or emotional kind of shore that we're embarking on or coming to. And just the imagery is really beautiful. And then the hermetic name for the minor arcana is Lord of Abandoned Success. So I think that is interesting, and we'll probably cover as we move through.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that T. Susan Chang refers to it as the Lord of Indolence, which is actually a word I had to look up because, which is funny because I like memorized the dictionary. Anyway, but indolence means the avoidance of activity or exertion. So it's very similar, but has a slightly different nuance, and I think worth mentioning that word.
Absolutely. Say that again, Kitty. The meaning.
The avoidance of activity or exertion.
Yeah, and that really calls to the nighttime quality of the day planets, doesn't it? Where it's like, we're not going to try to move this forward or exert ourselves. We're just going to like be letting the waves, lap up or whatever, you know? I almost think of like a boat where the person fell asleep and it just washed up onto the furthest shore. They're not rowing. They don't know where they are. They've fallen asleep on their, on their ship. And now they found themselves in like another land washed up on this farthest shore. And again, it's like abandoning the success, right? It's just like, I'm not going to really try to steer this ship. And sometimes in order to embark on very deep and meaningful journeys emotionally, we can't have too much cognition because like talk therapy and all these things, like, yes, definitely do all that, like make sense of your world and give yourself a story and do all those things. But sometimes you sort of have to let those day qualities of naming and categorizing move away in order to get to those layers of potential, whatever it is, like layers of trauma or whatever it is that's kind of underneath has to just express itself. And that's why dreams come through in such a kind of chaotic way when you're sleeping at night, because they're just trying to organize or release, and it doesn't need to make, that kind of like daytime quality sense. It's more of the sense that comes from the internal landscape, which is just kind of emotional. You can't necessarily name it, nor should you try in some cases. So it's like a very somatic kind of therapy versus like a talk therapy. Yeah. So
yeah, there are like these practical examples throughout life, like learning how to ride a bike, where you have to fall down a bunch of times, but then you eventually develop this muscle memory where you know exactly when you're going too fast or when you're about to fall down, what kind of body movements should you make. And it's generally just letting go of control and relaxing your muscles so the bike gets itself back up, because it's going to do that. Like sometimes it wobbles, but that if you just relax, you can like get back control in a second. But if you try to control it too much in that moment when it begins to wobble and you suddenly pull it back the other way, like to try and balance it yourself, you will lose control and you will fall instead of just like letting go, relaxing, and letting it balance itself back. So you learn that as you ride and fall.
And it reminds me of like a swimming metaphor too, where it's like, if you're not a strong swimmer, or if you're learning how to swim, like I can swim, but I'm not like an incredibly strong swimmer. So if I get tired or if I get freaked out, I'm like pushing the water more, and I'm like feeling like the more I try to control, the less control I have. Whereas like
it floats.
Right, when you just need to kind of like breathe and tread slowly while you're learning how to swim, but your sort of fears are can like drag you under. Like when people say like, oh, in the ocean, like the first thing that happens is people sort of panic, right, and fight against the current. Whereas if they didn't do that, they would have like less of a struggle. Or deep sea free diving, right, where you're just holding your breath, you're not going down with the tank. It's like you start to get low and you feel that pressure. If you start thinking, how long have I been under and I need to take a breath, like you've got to like swim as fast as you can back up. But if you're just like, okay, I think it's time now, and turn around and like stay calm and get yourself to the surface, it's a different sort of experience. And that's the type of somatic, like even trust or like letting go that you have to have, is think about swimming, I guess, or muscle memory, riding a bike, something like that.
And on a more kind of like again, pulling it back to the subconscious, an analogy might be the Saturn side might be dealing with something like trauma and want a checklist. What do I need to do to get over this? That's not possible. Even if somebody were to tell you exactly what you need to think and exactly what you need to do to get over it, that doesn't guarantee anything. Or not over it, but to process it and deal with it, that doesn't guarantee anything. You have to find your own path. You have to feel your way into it. You have to do the hard work of integrating it into your subconscious. And it's not easy.
No, that's a perfect example of like, we want a timeline for healing. Saturn wants a timeline for healing. Pisces, if it's healing, right? If it's just going into those depths of the unconscious, like how long am I going to be in therapy? How long is it going to take me to get over the breakup? How long is it going to, we want this tangible thing. And we do like have to take it day by day and like understand like, how am I feeling right now? And it's not linear. And I've heard certain therapists talk about like, in fact, this was recent that I was listening to something where they were like, it was talking about rushing the timeline of like wanting to get better or get over it or whatever subconscious trauma you're dealing with. Even assuming there's no outside trigger still happening, like from a family member or something, like let's not assume any of the details. Let's just say this person was comparing it to like the phases of the moon. Like no matter how bad you want healing, you still have to like wait for the crescent, wait for the full. You'll see it when it happens. Wait for the new. Like it is about like waiting in that sense and just letting the moon phase pass. Like you can't rush it. Is it going to be in 12 days? Is it going to be in 28 days? Either way, the cycle is going to happen and you're just a bystander to the cycle. So it's like, yeah, you can have your timelines and you can do your therapies, and that is a good thing to pursue. Like Saturn is there giving us something to pursue and a way to lay it out, but it really can't be rushed. You can't force yourself to have a lucid dream. You can't force yourself to like not have, you know, nightmares or whatever it is. It's a process of like, if you've ever tried to lucid dream, right? You journal enough, you try to bring your conscious awareness to it. So it's a time thing. And it can be a repetition of like getting in there, but you're not guaranteed, like the labyrinth, like, you know, you've set out to get to the core of this, but you're going to take maybe a few quote unquote wrong turns or whatever it is to get to the heart of the labyrinth, and also be able to recognize how to get yourself back out. So again, maybe here would be something where time can't be rushed in the vast expanse of the Jupiterian waters. You just sort of have to let yourself flow, which can be disorienting. And I want to get into Austin's work because he'll talk a little bit about the disorienting nature, and that confusion can lend itself to not always the most positive outcome, right? Because not everybody is going to go into their unconscious with this sort of illuminated, enlightened, like possibility or something like this. A lot of times when we're navigating our subconscious, it really is just that we're acting out our unconsciousness, and it can be quite a confusing endeavor. So, or disorienting. So Austin talks about Pisces as the beginning of the end of differentiated awareness. The faces of Pisces, and all of them here, will show us a fearful and ecstatic going back, a drunken stumbling home. So he talks about like the home origin and what that is for us and what lies before and after. He talks about that we might come to recognize this, our imprisonment in our own reality, as a construct. Or as we go through his work, we're going to notice we're talking about how we're looking at reality and our perception. And I think that's very Piscean, right? Because Pisces could be like totally in some kind of crazy state, and they're just like, but it's good. Like, I wouldn't have learned this if I didn't have this, you know? And I have like a Pisces friend who reflects that to me all the time. And I'm like, I didn't need that. I didn't, you know, but they're so, the perception of what they're dealing with is dealt with so positively. So it really has a lot to do with perception and how we're orienting ourselves around that.
AKA toxic positive. No, I'm joking.
I mean, yes, also that, right? You know, so on a personal level, he talks about the discovery of our unconscious and that we are the maker, that we find none other than ourselves is the maker of this maze, essentially. It's the internalization of power, and the maze is ours to create, and the soul is the architect. The secret heart of wisdom that we did not expect. He talks about it not being an abomination, but exactly as it should be. And I think this is that, like, that Pisces optimism that you can see, or that Jupiterian optimism is, you know, like, I created this reality. Actually, everything that I go through is exactly as it should be according to my soul's, you know, wisdom, or whatever, that kind of like idea. And this realization transforms the structure itself from a prison into a palace. So liberation is achieved through insight alone here.
To me, it's interesting hearing that, how he talks about that being the two outermost planets that are visible from the traditional standpoint. So the ones that deal with the broader topics in society, broader structures, the broader or higher ranking people and things like that. But notice how the idea behind this is almost like I create my own reality. So reality kind of allows that to happen in a way. It's not that that person is right, but it's also not that they're wrong. They somehow learn intuitively the balance between being too arrogant and thinking that life has to curb itself to your will, and just being open enough to life to accept its events as what is given for you to work with the best. Perspective really is the key for liberation.
Yeah, and you think of like Pisces is also could be very religious, because we still have this Jupiterian quality, whereas
Zealotry.
yeah, and whereas like maybe potentially in the fire sign it would be like philosophy or like getting my point across or whatever, whereas Jupiter's water sign here in Pisces might be like, it's okay, you just have to like trust God's plan. It doesn't make any sense to like anyone else, me included, but I'm just like going with like, what God has planned for me or whatever that is.
Trust the process.
Right, and it is very much having to do with perspective and transforming that perspective into a story that we can tell ourselves that serves us, which can really be a part of healing, right? Is like telling ourselves a different story. But those stories that we tell ourselves also can be kind of like feigned appearances as well. And like that whole blurred
avoidant behavior.
The whole blurred line, which in water signs we do talk about, addiction or drinking, or some of these kind of things that can give that like watery haze of just like, it's gonna be fine, I'm just like kind of giving up some of my control, and I'm going to tell myself this story because it serves me, if for better or worse. And that kind of like religious trust, or that kind of like trust in the unknowing, unconscious part of ourselves.
And again, all the cards here, as well as the sign, by being the last of the zodiac, are really high in order. So they're talking about broad, super conscious topics, if I can put it like that. Like, what do I mean by that? There's a passage, I think, in Ephesians in the Bible where we are advised by Paul to keep our minds in higher, concepts or things from above. Pisces is kind of like that. And it's kind of that vibe that you're describing. It's like, keep your head on things, keep positive, think about, be gentle, be kind, give the other cheek, and things like that. But it's not because you don't feel the bad about it. It's because you are hopeful that acting like that, like the martyr, which is also a Saturnian theme when involved with Pisces, you would get some kind of reward in a higher sense of the word, which again, Jupiter and Saturn being the outermost planets, outermost spheres of the planets, and higher ideals.
Yeah, and it can be, as much as it can be positive, and we should, feed our like highest ideas, which is, things are going to be okay, and like positive outlook on life and things like that. It can be toxic too, because you're just trying to keep your head above water, not really looking at what's underneath you, which is a whole ocean of shit or whatever,
Part of it.
And it is good to say, okay, life is like this terrible mystery, and I'm going to, take it with a spoonful of sugar, that medicine or whatever. Like, that's good to a point. And again, it's where that your perception is and how much you're willing to look at of the unconscious, or how much you're willing to sort of like feign that appearance, or like, it can be interesting. And I think Austin will kind of highlight that here. He says, this face talks about the mystery of emerging, accompanied by the shifts in our perception. He says how real that is for people that have this space or carry this space. And he says it can be used to create confusion as well, as kind of like gaslighting, schizophrenia, things like that. He mentions that just because
this is something that John Opsipeus, I think, mentions in the Pythagorean deck text I want to bring up when we're talking about the tarot and the moon, but it ties into this divisive nature of consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely, because we can shift our perceptions. And again, Saturn being feigned appearance, moon have an element of deceit. It's that. So then he goes on to say that this face pretends journeys and wanderings, and it has an impetus behind it. So he mentioned Ibn Ezra reports it as going home, and home is not easily defined in this decan. Like if you're just out in sea and you're really trying to understanding, like, where's the home for my heart, where's the home for my soul, like what really is home in all of this confusion and all these options and all this like oceanic movement inside of us, like what is going home for me? Finding that kind of solid ground within the unconscious is a real mission, you know? And then he goes on to say that this first face is the great mystery. This is the convergent point of perception and reality. And of course, how those lines are perceived and blurred at times. He says, yet few who wander these plains understand their situation, and the halls of the labyrinth hold more madmen than seekers. So just that kind of idea of like alternative perception versus reality, I think is illuminated in that.
Well, this is following up to building up to the sun. So when you look at the sun card in the right of way, and Katie will never bring up that again because there are no more sun decans. We have a kid, we have like a child or two kids playing there in those cards and those depictions normally. And think about how children just think about life as given. They don't think about death because their instinct is just to be alive and protected and to have everything given to them. That's the instinct of a child. And it's very traumatic for them, and the person grows up very fucked up and they don't have that given for them. That's why many countries fight to have children's rights in the law, you know, because otherwise they're just going to have very corrupted minds growing up as the future of their country. So the idea of the sun card depicting a happy child is the idea that we get to a point where we trust circumstance, fortune in a way, not because everything is happy, but because we learned kind of to be happy in a broader sense of the word. You know, we learn to get what we need. We learn to know where to go for what we need, and we are just thriving in that way.
Yeah.
But we get there, we have to get to through the process of the moon.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we have the star, right? Which it's no plan. It's just like, oh, there is something out there. There is hope, right? And then we have the moon, which is slightly more illuminated because it's saying like, here's all the unconscious fears you had around the tower crashing, about the outer parts of the unknown. Now you have a little more illumination. So you're forced to see more, but you're forced to see the shadow side of more, right? And then by the time we get to the sun, we have this sort of like rebirth, like this full illuminative, like warm quality. We're still here. We're in the night still, like of the star. We're in that cold moment. We're cold and naked and we're in the unknown. And we have just a little bit more illumination, but what we see is scary, or could be, right? Because it's still in the cloak of night. It's still in the shadowy underground, and there's still no selection or illumination or warmth that you receive like in the day. You know, we see like jackals in one of the moon cards. You kind of see like that liminal space of like everything could feel like entrapment or death, or things can still feel dark and you're looking for hope in the night. And you're kind of shown, I guess you're shown disappointment, where the kids by the sun, they're just like, oh, like everything's great. Here in the moon, you have like all this, like, I don't know if everything is great. I have to choose it to be great in my subconscious or something. But
basically having yourself lapidated by constant conflict, right? Internal conflict with external circumstance, and going that within that back and forth dynamic, whereas the sun is just being.
And we know for sure that emotions are a tumultuous place, and they're very moving and they're very changing, which is very watery. It's very moon-like. So we know that emotions for a lot of people can be scary because they can't be tracked is logically. That's why we try to prescribe logic to them and organize them and things like that, which I think is Saturn, like just trying to navigate or build a ship, shall we say, a Saturn ship in these like waters that are really kind of overwhelming and big. So we're trying to maybe chart a course and bring some kind of structure to what is otherwise dark and perhaps scary.
I just want to say, David, that is a wonderful word, lapidate. Thank you.
What?
Lapidate. Thank you for using that word.
Yes, thank you.
It's a beautiful word. It means to kill with stones.
Often used about like jewelry and like stones and rings and stuff like that.
Love it.
So shall we just read the Picatrix now so that we can kind of see how it plays out through the imagery of the cards and stuff like that?
So in the Picatrix, in the first face of Pisces, a man with two bodies who looks as though he's giving a gesture of greetings with his hands. So this is a face of peace and humility, debility, many journeys, misery, seeking wealth, miserable life. This is his form. So
it sounds very like mixed, good and bad, or maybe mostly bad, but it reminds me of the moon card.
It really does, where it's like you can kind of like drag your perception out of it. Like it's like terrible, but also like you're seeking like the wealth that's there. And also I like the two-bodied gesture because it shows the double-bodied kind of like nature.
many journeys, but also like an amicable nature. But I like the way that he translates it is like he seems to be giving a greeting gesture. So it is intentionally put there in the way that it's like, can I really see that at a distance? That's what you imagine. Like he seems to be giving a greeting. So you can't see his eyes properly, perhaps, or you can't see his features properly to really understand what he's feeling. Maybe that's what I feel like with the feigned appearances.
Yeah, it seems like some way like, oh, it seems welcome and positive, but is it? Or, you know, like what?
And for
what
anyone who
gestures-
tried to date a Pisces man, try to get a straight answer out of them. Try to get a straight answer out of them.
Are you
when they're
saying they're wishy-washy? What? Okay,
All right,
now
you
this
said
might be a
that.
diversion, but I'm offering one of you to the opportunity to take this further because it's a little bit messed up in my mind. But the way that you talk about like seeming and appearances and things really calls to mind some Robert Schmidt lectures about omens and the appearance of omens and how the moon is very representative of this, the waxing and waning, the appearing and the falling away of the omens.
The moon is the appearance that speaks. And he talks about the moon having an auditory quality. So it has to do with like hearing.
Sound compels you. Sound is something that if I say a word to you, you will imagine what I'm saying. If I tell you about an object, it will appear in your mind, or the concept of it, the feeling that you have of it will appear in your mind, whether you want it or not, even for a second, because I audibly threw that at you. So it's a sort of magical thing.
And,
Yeah.
and by that token, we should talk about actually the exaltations and the falls and that happen in this sign. Mercury. Mercury is in its fall and its detriment here.
Right.
So even
And
though
that's-
sound is compelling, it doesn't mean
right. It's the magic and manipulation of word, right? And the magic and manipulation of sound, like when they talk about in the 109 names of Shiva, happy Mahashivratri for everyone. He who creates through sound, right? It's like a sound vibration. They talk about maybe the pyramids like being built through like a vibration or something like this. It's the vibration of sound. And yeah, it can compel, it can make images in your mind. And when Robert Schmidt is talking about it, I think he's talking about it's not just something we see, right? It's not just, oh, I saw the crow and it means this. The fact that it means something means that it spoke. And that's what we're talking about with the omen. It's not just you know, that the random stick was crossing your path and you just walked right over it and you didn't whatever. You said, ah, the stick is crossing my path. It must mean something. So that's like the idea of like dealing with that lunar, like speaking is the quality of the unconscious. It calls out to you. So it's not just like I've seen random birds all day. No, I noticed that crow actually right there, or that the way that stick fell, or the bones mean this when I cast them this way.
You just think about a soundtrack in a movie. If you change the soundtrack to a particular scene, you will see the general feel that you have about that scene change as well. I posted something to Instagram, like I retweeted something on Instagram that was like a Voldemort scene of him like coming back to life in Harry Potter 4, and then you just have a romantic soundtrack put in the back, and then Wormtail shows up, and it's just seemed like a romance scene between Wormtail and Voldemort, and it's amazing. And that's kind of the perspective thing. Mercury is good in here, like for expressing with through music, I would suppose, because poetry, it would be a subject. Poetry, music, ways that are more appealing to the subjective of a person. They would be able to connect better through those indirect ways, I would suppose. But that's like one mitigation where Mercury would find an oasis amidst a sea of confusion, you know, or a desert of confusion, I would say, not a sea of confusion. That would make sense with the oasis. See?
You know, and when you're thinking about like a soundtrack, it's something that, and this is, I'm going to talk about this like in relation to like omens or something. So when you're thinking about like a soundtrack, they're trying to compel something underneath. It's a big subtext. So you're watching the characters and you're hearing what they're saying, but they want you to feel a certain something, whether it's, you know, it's daunting music that you're going to find out later it wasn't a romantic scene or something like that, but it wants you to feel that without really saying that. So on the surface, it might be a romantic scene, but the music is a little undercasted because that person may end up like dying at the end of the movie or whatever. So they're giving you like an emotional subtext. That's
Hollywood even have, they even have like these specific tunes that have been used throughout centuries to signify specific things, and they're so culturally attached that they know they can just input it into any kind of track that people will unconsciously, subconsciously, because they hear it everywhere in certain times of year or in certain movies, they will know that that means death. For instance, there's a specific tune that's being used, for instance, since the 13th century, that means death. You know?
Yeah. Okay, so that is so interesting. Yeah, that is so interesting to me because it's almost like the closest they could get to the objective with a very subjective medium, and that to me sounds like a Moon-Saturn opposition, like a dichotomy here.
And it's something that I'm going to get into also with the Pythagorean text about the moon card that I found very interesting when we get into the tarot in a bit.
But yeah, it's like it's speaking at something that's like the undertone of whatever's happening up here. It's speaking underneath, so that like subtext, and it is compelling you, which the moon does. It is controlling you, which Saturn does, right? It's speaking, it wants you to do something or feel something in a certain type of way. So there's this subtle, like subconscious, like text happening. And when you think about like something being,
and then you see again how someone who's a lunatic or a person who is completely got their spirits moved by the moon, they are lost in the sounds. They are lost in the sounds of their mind.
And lost in the subtext, which can be very confusing because like and that's another thing about omens, right? Like I know it meant something, but I don't know what it means till later when I go, oh, that was the crow that spoke, or that was the stick. But you're just like, oh, this is ominous, and you don't know what it means, and you ascribe something to it later or something like that. That's also this kind of like compelling subtext or whatever. This subtle like manipulation of the unconscious that can be happening with the omenistic subtext, that it wants to compel an underlying feeling. And you see this with like, you know, people that are manipulating and lying, or just ourselves when we're manipulating and lying to ourselves. We have the soundtrack that we're pushing. It's not what they said or what they did or what, you know, or it's not how they really, you know, acted. It's the subtext of how it comes through. And that can be with dreams as well. You have a dream and you're like, oh, this thing, it doesn't sound so crazy when I told it, but it felt so whatever. It felt so ominous, or it felt so beautiful. And it was actually a sad scene in my dream, but it just felt so compelling. So it's that like underneath subtext that we're dealing with that is like obviously very confusing and very subject to interpretation, for better or worse. With that being said, do we want to display the tarot and kind of get into it?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so I have these a little bit zoomed in today so we can see better some of the details on these cards. So that is intentional. I will scroll over as we're talking about them. But we're starting with the moon card. We have the first appearance of the moon card as the beginning, the first decan of Pisces. And you'll see in a variety of decks a couple common symbols that I just want to point out. The first is a picture of the moon, clearly. One of the things about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck that is interesting is that this could be something of an eclipse, which mimics what we actually see in the Eight of Cups. In a few minutes, we'll get to that. You see some dogs or jackals, dogs and jackals, howling at the moon here. Again, in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck on the far left, there is a lobster at the bottom. Interestingly, in some decks, or maybe just some interpretations, this is a crab, which of course is a symbol for Cancer, the domicile of the moon.
In the Pythagorean deck, interestingly, he just says that it's a scorpion with crab-like features or something like that.
Oh, aka a lobster.
Yeah, well, he says like it's and that's what he says. He's like, that's why we see it changing. He says something about it being lobster-like or crab-like, but with a scorpion. He refers to it as a scorpionic, crab-like, lobster-like figure.
As if it were an amphibious, but with that crustacean feel.
Yeah.
Still.
I think it's the poison too that he's trying to say, that it's like it contains that scorpionic poison, but it's seen as this like crustacean or bottom feeding kind of like water element. So it's really, David, I noticed that too. Like it was pretty pointed to be like, oh,
it's
that's
like an amphibious mix of a crustacean and a arthropod. Arachnid. Thank you.
Well, the really cool thing, though, if you really think about it, is that this is Pisces. It's a water sign elementally, and the other two water signs are Cancer, the crab, and Scorpio, the scorpion. So it's a little bit it's really pointing, I think, to a Pisces vibe to this card, even if, and I believe I've probably misspoken a few different times when we were talking about, for instance, the High Priestess card, because it is hard to get clear about what is the card of the planet as a Decanic ruler and as a sign ruler. But here it's very clear that it's Pisces, and especially with that mention of the scorpion crab kind of hybrid, seems to make sense.
The moon rules Cancer, so people would think the moon card would be Cancer. Now remember, our Cancer card is the Chariot. Just as a, you know,
the associations of the cards, they have to do not only with the planetary associations that they have, but also with the feeling of the sign through their modality, through their element, and through their through those two. Because you see here, the moon card has that kind of mutable quality of being dual. You see the towers dividing the card, you see the path in the middle dividing the card, you see the two dogs dividing the card, you see in the Rider-Waite the depiction of the sun and the moon together, representing the masculine and feminine together in a new moon, which is an eclipse, where in a total eclipse, the day goes completely dark, right? So it's this darkening of light. And Schmidt also describes the new moon as this process in a certain lecture about a certain technique. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but know that there is a context. I'm just, using this as a little piece. But the new moon is described by him as this moment of uncertainty, where you really don't know which path to follow, but you have to follow the sound. So it's as if there's a piper at the end of this road and you have to just follow that particular sound under the light of the moon, which is kind of treacherous, right? And this speaks also to Hecate. Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yes, actually, I do, but can we hold off on that? Because the last card here is the Mother Peace card, where we talk about the 3 faces of the goddess. And I want to talk about Hecate then. But going back to the Rider-Waite-Smith, you mentioned the towers or the pillars. They kind of mimic pillars that appear in a couple of other major arcana cards that I want to mention briefly, which are the High Priestess, the card of the moon as the decanic ruler of signs throughout the zodiac, or decans throughout the zodiac. It also is in the Hierophant. So that's almost like a masculine version of spirituality, and kind of like a structure and exertion of religion on others. So it has that kind of spiritual influence as well. And then we also have Justice, which is also has those 2 pillars on its side. So there's a little bit we could do to extrapolate on that, but in the interest of time, I might just move on to the next card.
I wanted to just mention about the 2 pillars is, you know, we might be grateful to have the moonlight after the star, because it gives us, like, let's say the new moon happened during the star and now somehow we're at eclipse, or maybe we're at, you know, I don't know, but we have a little bit of light, little bit more light than we did with the star, but it's obscured somehow or changeable somehow, so it's still got that scary element. And I think of this pond sometimes that we're sitting in, and we're looking from the area of the pond outward, and I think of that as like almost the star looking on, or we're coming from that same pond that maybe the star was, you know, distributing or playing with. And now when we look out in the moon card, when we have those 2 towers, this is the first time that we've seen structure since our structure collapsed with the tower card. And, you know, before we're just kind of like under the light of the star, and now we're just in this natural world and natural environment, naked to the elements, that type of a thing. And now when we get shown like, oh, there is a kingdom, or there is structure, these 2 towers could be like on the outskirts of a town, like sort of protecting the town or something like this, right? So these are the outermost signs of a town that's yet to come. And I think it could provide like another way of looking at fear, because the last time we had any structure, it collapsed. And now we're seeing the outskirts of like another structure, and just seeing like the dogs howling at the moon, one tame and one maybe a wolf or something. It's showing that dualistic nature of like the black and white of the towers and the structure that they represent, and also the fear. Like, is it tamed? Is it wild? Is it going to collapse? Like, is it going to be structure that's good for me? Am I in peril? Am I going to be welcomed back into some random town? How can I start over? Like, just those ideas of like seeing structure for the first time kind of in the distance is not necessarily super comforting in this case, because the last time we, you know, experienced it, it was destructive.
And it's a boundary similar to what Saturn offers.
Right, exactly. So just that
threshold, right?
Yeah, that other threshold. And we had thought it all collapsed, right? And then now we see the structure and we're sort of forced to look at it again, but it's in completely new light, and it's still got this dichotomy of kind of ominous eclipse vibe and wild dog versus tame dog.
And something that the Pythagorean deck brings, and something that the depiction in the middle of this image brings, is a crescent moon. And it's just to bring the idea of little light. It's even amongst clouds in this particular deck, like coming out of clouds. So it is really untrustworthy light, or just like a little bit of light that is illuminating, but not enough and not so, you know, trustworthy. But it also evidentiates the path between conscious and unconscious, right? You see that under the light of the moon, you can see this divided path that has kind of the symmetric vibe throughout these depictions. You see the bushes there and the card of the science deck. you see that there is a balance of 2 images to one side of the moon, 2 images to the other, one underneath. So there is this, the woman is kind of Vitruvian Man style. So you do have these symmetry dichotomies being highlighted, but the light of the moon kind of evidentiates mostly this middle path. And this is what I wanted to get to earlier on. Do you guys have any comments on that particular?
I mean, I'll let you talk about the middle path from the Pythagorean deck, but when I see this, and this isn't in the Pythagorean deck, this is just something that kind of like came to me when I was thinking about the towers being sort of ominous or scary, is like there is only one path out in this case. Like that could be one way to look at it. And I like the middle path, the way that the Pythagorean deck really talks about it. But if we just talk about like there is only one way out, and it's long and it's perilous, and
maybe goes off into the mountains.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't see the end still. And yet I know that there's these wild dogs, and I know I have to tame this inner nature, and I don't know what the tower means because last time it collapsed. So it is a big trust issue here, because things are obscured yet lit just enough for you to see your fear. And there's only sort of like this one choice in this case, like the one path if you want out of the pond or whatever it is, you know? So it does have like an ominous, obscured kind of like fear and trust dichotomy of like, which am I going to choose, the wild path or the tame path? And either way, I have to walk the path.
Even in the Rider-Waite, you see a depiction of a hill, one standing on a hill and another standing in the middle of what seems to be a forest to the left. That's the way I'm looking at it. So a more internalized, one is more feminine or introverted, the other is more externalized, visible. But both of them, as you're saying, Elsa, are towers that are prone to collapse if you choose to build your trust onto one of them. That's why the middle path is generally the answer in these broader inner questionings, right?
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
In real life, yeah, we have a choice. We could go totally tame, or we could go totally wild, and we could be completely imbalanced and suffering both of those. But the idea of like the real way through our subconscious and our emotional realm is you kind of have to get up and walk the middle path, although it's winding, in order to be, you know, surviving or healthy on any like level. You can't just say it's only my dreams and my fears, or it's only going to be like, okay. It's like, no.
Doesn't that sound like temperance to you?
Yes.
Which is the card of Jupiter's other sign, Sagittarius. You've got to go the middle way. You can't go too far in either end.
And you see that there is a path, I think, in the Rider-Waite depiction in the background of temperance that also leads into mountains, if I'm not mistaken. So if you, there's an analogy here, definitely. And there is a pond in that imagery as well, where the angels stand.
And I don't know if we're, exactly, right? The same pond that we noticed was in temperance, was in the star card, is also here now, again, with us. I don't know if we'll end up going through the Scapini deck this time, or if it'll be next time as far as the images that we're showing. But I just want to note the kind of like mercurial Jupiterian figure in the moon card in the Scapini, because it shows the two towers, but atop one of the towers is a looking glass, like not a looking glass, a telescope. And on the other one is a magician, all dressed in complete purple, holding like a staff. So it's like a magician, or like a Jupiterian magician figure, kind of like out there. And it just reminded me of like the omen thing of like looking up to the stars for an omen, or like those magical like incantations or something like this Jupiterian like figure. So I'm sure we'll get to it throughout Pisces at some point, but it just kind of reminded me of that Mercury fall, but like that philosopher's stone, kind of like looking for omens, and maybe just like we see in these towers, are they watchtowers? Because that's what they look like. It looks like a fortified watchtower, essentially. And that's what again, we get back to that idea of like omens or ominous or something like that.
I love that. And I didn't include the Scapini deck in this slideshow, but in future Pisces videos, I will make sure to include the Scapini card so we can analyze that a little bit more closely. As with all Scapini deck cards, it's very rich in symbolism, and so we'll be dissecting that a little later on. In the middle of the screen right now, though, is the moon card from the Micah Ulrich deck. And in addition to what David said about having the crescent moon there, as well as the symmetry, we also see very similar symbols as the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. It's just to kind of nail down that that is a common set of symbols, but also in the background, in place of pillars, we have two hooded figures, which in this deck look exactly like the Hermit card. So I just wanted to reiterate the connection between the moon and the Hermit that we mentioned earlier, because they're both a little bit about like pulling inward and looking inward for wisdom or a path or a direction. And it is, in fact, the Hermit who is traveling through the snowy mountains in most depictions of that card. The science deck is a super interesting one this time. And so this is part of the reason why I wanted to zoom in on it. It is represented in the science deck by chemical spirits. And that's a little Piscean. We talked about earlier some of the Pisces keywords being addiction or finding yourself lost in or dissolved in a chemical state, for instance. So in this deck, the moon is really pinpointed as having a silent influence over the natural cycles. An analogy is linked between those natural cycles with how certain plants over time have evolved to create a physiological reaction in humans, whether that is something like peyote, making you trip out of your mind, or aspirin, providing easy pain relief. These things have evolved in some ways to be useful or to manipulate a human's subjective experience. And what's even more interesting is that just like with the moon, there's a shadowy side to the use of these plants, essentially. And those are the plants that are actually depicted around the edge of the water here. I admit I cannot name them, but they are all plants that are the origin of some, again, physiological reaction that it inspires in humans.
Absolutely. It makes me think of like how flowers are like doing this subconscious like dance to get bees to pollinate them type of a experience. Like that happens to humans in the natural world. If you think of how fruits or flowers are sort of like compelling us to interact with them, or like plant spirits in general. So this can definitely be like a wise plant spirit medicine vibe, but it also can be like, I just want to stay in this alternate reality because it's more real to me than our like, messed up system or whatever it is. And it can lead to like escapism in a big way.
Yeah.
So, just I guess looking at that, like the alluringness of like plants that bloom at night, like datura or something, like, there's many beautiful flowers that only open up at night. And some of them also have like a properties to where if you took them, they would be, like medicinal or whatever, poisonous even.
Consciousness altering.
Yes, properties of these like night blooming plants that are so compelling and so fragrant and, so sort of like in the sublunary realm.
Yeah, it's a beautiful card.
I mean, I think flowers have a lot of that sort of like subconscious vibe of like a soundtrack, because it's like, are we attracted to their beauty, how they look, or are we attracted to the fragrance and then the way they look? Like that. To me, fragrance is another kind of watery sense organ or sensory thing, because it's a subtext. It's like, oh yeah, like smelling a certain way. I'm a fragrance person. Like I'm into essential oils and all kinds of fragrances and things like this. And it's this compelling subtext to what you're actually looking at or to what you're actually doing or whatever. It's a compelling, you're kind of
scent memory.
There you
Flowers
go.
are kind of like the sirens of birds and insects, because if you think about it, we also made sirens look pretty after a while. And in
After a
many,
while, yeah.
because they are appealing to the eyes as well once you gaze upon them, but they're initially not meant to be gazed upon. They're just meant to be heard, and you're just meant to imagine this beautiful creature. But when you look at flowers, their scent and their colors are appealing to certain senses within certain species of animals that are the ones that have evolved to be most in contact with them, right? So there's a level here of trust that you have to have with this particular sign, with this particular card, and just free fall kind of trust fall kind of method. But knowing when to do that through circumstance is a learned ability as well. This is why it's in the first decan of Pisces, I think, with Saturn. It's something that, again, you learn how to ride a bike that way or how to swim. It's not without practice, right? But it is an instinctual kind of muscle. It is something that you're not meant to think about. It's just exercising something that's why it's the middle path. You're trying to exert consciousness over something that is not meant to be intelligible in a way. You are still creating a way to cope, to deal with it. Not sure if I made much sense, but
no, but I think music, I think it does play to like music and scent and things like that, where it's like using our sense perception to create a feeling and a subcontext to the experience that we're having rationally, which I think is huge here.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that sort of, subjective experience. The other thing that we have to remember is that the moon is very representative of the divine feminine. And so that's the last card that I have here for the moon on the right in the Mother Peace deck, which is just full of symbols about the divine feminine and the three-faced goddess. The moon in its waxing, full, and waning are considered to be representative of those three phases: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. We also have a woman here who is bathing in the waters, which are also going to be calling back to Pisces. You also see a boat indicating some sort of journey, some birds also indicating a journey. And I believe that this circle in the center is reminiscent of the labyrinth that you were talking about earlier, Elsa, and the needing to kind of feel your way into the center and feel your way out. Even though there are maybe hard walls, boundaries in between them, you can't brute force your way through it.
Yeah, this is definitely a labyrinth. This is the classic architecture of a labyrinth, where you enter in and the middle is almost like this phallic representation. So yeah, this is like a classic labyrinth depiction in the middle of the center of the card.
And again, we are relating the star later on to the Eight of Cups, because she's related to all the eights as well in tarot by being the sum of 1 and 7 in the traditional scheme of the Rider-Waite or the decks that follow that tradition. Here in the moon, you have this journey being represented by the birds that you guys were talking about. But they're following their instinct, and the masculine side of it is the action that is taken towards that feminine. So again, we are seeing the masculine represented by the action that the birds are taking to go in a certain direction, but they're not thinking like a human would, meaning you have to use your instinct. Again, Elsa, you mentioned the dogs earlier. You have to tame the beast, as you said. Not necessarily tame it, but just let it take you where you need to go. It's not a safe journey here. We're not talking about being safe through that journey because, you were promised to get to illumination. No, sometimes you'll hit a dead end. Sometimes you will shoot water, and all of those things. So the birds are really in danger when they're doing that particular journey. It's a very tiresome journey. Think about it. They always live in a particular place. And then you have to suddenly move through so many miles to get to a warmer climate just through instinct. Imagine the courage that takes. If it weren't for the bunch of other animals doing that with them, bunch of other birds, mainly the migratory birds are the ones that do it in flocks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine the courage that it would take for instinctually you just take up and be like, oh, no, I'm done. Bye, too cold. You know?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that we're talking about like that air and water dichotomy here again that we talked about last time about how they're kind of like sisters or like enmeshed from one in some spaces.
Yeah.
But and that having to do with like the action or the intelligibleness that you were talking about as a masculine quality of air and the real feminine mysteries that are represented by water or the emotional mysteries. Two things I wanted to mention here. One is T. Susan, while you were speaking, David, it reminded me of the story that T. Susan was telling in her chapter, T. Susan Chang, in 36 Secrets, which is, she was talking about nightmares, which we see here. We see dreaming, but we also see nightmares. And she was talking about, you know, she having this reoccurring nightmare her whole life about being chased, and then at one point in her life in her 40s she turned around and faced the chaser, and it was just ordinary, and they put up no fight to stop the chase. They just kind of like went away, and she'd never had that dream again since. And David talked about like the courage of action here, and I feel like we could be very fearful to take action because, like, you know, it's just the nightmare again and again. It's the chase again and again. Like it's the courage to face the fear, which is turn around in the dream, which almost seems impossible to have any agency in your dreams in the first place, right? And then you turn around and you face the fear, and then it's not actually scary. It's not a goblin, and it just like leaves you alone. Just the idea of the fear the entire time sort of propels itself, like the mysteries of the unconscious. It's like, oh my God, I'm so like, you deal with this maybe your whole life, and then you go to therapy and you're like, oh, it's just that thing. Like when I look at it, it's not actually that scary, and like I can make sense of it. And so it's like something about like the fear around taking action, or the courage in order to look at this scary thing. And when I'm looking at the courage to look at the scary thing, I think a little bit about faith, but in the positive sense. Like a lot of times faith, we're like, oh, that's kind of dumb and naive and whatever. And when it's religious, it can get caught up in all of these like connotations that maybe are less pleasing or we see to be not good. But like the idea of faith to me in a good sense has a lot to do with courage, where it's like, I have courage to look at this thing. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I just have faith that, you know, I need to like step into this unconscious space to like look at the thing. So, you know, I heard some of those things.
For a lot of you out there who are traumatized kids and who had to dissociate and be adulting, you know, when you were very young for your parents, you will know the feeling of being courageous in the face of fearsome circumstances, in the sense of being like, well, I'm a kid. I don't know how to deal with this shit. My parents clearly don't also, but they will like me better, and they will have time for me if I am able to solve the issue for them, right? And I'm not saying that this is right, but think about the way the kids innocently, even if they don't know how, will instantly create a picture of why the situation is going wrong and try to solve it for their parents, even if it is something really basic. For them, it's like, wow, I am working so hard to solve these really difficult scenarios. I'm not giving an example here of my own reality because it's the one that I can access the easiest, but it's this fearsome quality of the diverse, how'd you say that? Divergent circumstances to your expectations and how you adapt courageously.
Yeah, and I guess when you're working with trauma, if you go, you know, into like therapy when you're older and you've been trauma bonded or traumatically abused or something like this, you learn that you actually built those coping mechanisms to protect yourself. And that's the kind of like courage, faith thing that I'm talking about. It's actually, you didn't have the tools, and looking at that is like, you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't do anything scary. In fact, you were really resilient to build those types of coping skills. And I guess that's the type of courage or the faith that I'm talking about, is we actually, the trust bond was broken if we were abused, but that resilience is a very Pisces thing. If you can go back in your healing journey and look, hey, I didn't really have the tools, I didn't have the emotional digestive system, but I still, in the face of that, as a child through my, or whatever, through my trauma, I still was looking to problem solve. I still was looking to fix. You're looking for these coping mechanisms in a way. Yes, it wasn't good, but your own resilience took that scary inner nature and had the courage to sort of face it and try to fix and all that. So it's like, it takes away some of that shame and guilt.
So again, following your instinct and acting the best you can within that situation, like the bird migrating, it doesn't really know where it's going, but it knows somehow.
And again, it's about our perception, right? And it's about those perceptions that we've built and coping mechanisms, right? Escape mechanisms, coping mechanisms, the story we tell ourselves around all of that has to do with that bigger thing Austin was talking about, like the kind of like perception of reality and coping mechanism. And all of those like escapism and coping mechanisms, they arise here in Pisces or in this space because of the fact that we are dealing with the depths of extreme unconsciousness in ourselves, in our parents, and those around us. Like, it's very wild and murky waters when we blend not only our own subconscious reality, but that of our societies and our friends and families, especially our loved ones. So one more thing I wanted to bring up before we move past, because I think this card always brings this up for me, this particular Mother Peace card is, and just to be explicit about it, the sacred waters, right? And we saw that in the Mother Peace star card with the woman bathing in the luxurious like hot spring with flowers and the natural world blooming around. And you see that again with chemical spirits, with kind of the person being in this pool with this sort of night garden around them, right? And being sort of embraced by the sacred waters. And here in the moon card, I get very much this feeling of like cleansing, but not just that, baptism, that kind of idea of baptism. And I hate to spoiler this in case someone was dying to mention this, but we see Jesus Christ as the nativity here, right? And the idea of, and this can be, it's not just
which is totally made up, by the way. Nobody knows Jesus' birth time, but people conjecture. You know?
Right. And I'm not even talking about like Christian baptism, but I just thought I'd mention that in this way where it's like, submerging yourself in the renewing sacred waters and that kind of like cleansing that it has. Like, it's like she's faced to the gods naked and she's about to baptize herself in this new like spirit. And in doing that, she's giving herself over to the unconscious waters, not being afraid, going out into, you know, everybody, I shouldn't say everyone knows, but if you've ever gone into a body of water at night, you'll know the vulnerability that induces in any circumstance, any body of water, but especially a natural body of water, and just being that renewal, that cleansing. And I just wanted to take that idea and take the opportunity to mention salt, because we see these like oceanic salty waters, and salt is like a Saturn thing, and salt is also used in magic as like cleansing. So when we see her in this water, we also have this idea of the ships, Saturn, salt, the kind of idea of Saturnine being the water's edge, and also the idea of salt being like a cleansing and a renewal, and kind of the idea of her going into the water at night and just how much, I guess, surrender is in this figure's body and face, and how much like it's almost like an exhaustion renewal dichotomy that you feel when you're just ready to just give it up and just submerge yourself in this like renewal, this baptism.
Yeah, I really like that. I did not pick up on that right away, but the baptism piece is super applicable, very relevant when you think about the Pisces, I guess, archetypes of the martyr, for instance, and things like this. Yeah,
and the Piscean faith aspect, where it's very sensory, it's a ritual, you're taken by someone and you're submerged under the water. It's a symbolic gesture where you don't see like in the Sagittarian like preachy Bible zealot version. Here you kind of see like this surrender, this submergence, this ritual bathing. It's very much the feminine quote unquote Holy Spirit aspect of faith in that way. That trust, again, that trust dichotomy, that trust game, being born anew, and that surrender kind of vibe.
Totally. Let's move on to the World, which is the card of Saturn as Decanic Lord. And we've seen the World before, specifically in the Seven of Pentacles, the Five of Wands, the Three of Swords, and the Ten of Wands, those decans. So, and we also mentioned about how the Decanic Lord Saturn can kind of take Saturn's gift on the road. I love the card on the far right for this decan particularly. This is from the Dreaming Way Tarot, and it depicts the world as an old man kind of dozing off underneath an archway, which is supposed to mimic the circle around the world in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Remember that Saturn is both boundaries and that which exceeds beyond boundaries. So those arches are very, very relevant. But what I like about that far card on the right is the fact that you could say he's dreaming. And so there's really kind of like a Pisces Saturn element here that's very interesting.
And with the glasses off as well, like it's the idea of
not seeing.
Yeah, the not seeing or needing help seeing or releasing, kind of like falling asleep dreaming, because you see the books too, which is very Saturn, and you see the smoking and you see the old man and you see the not seeing, and then you just think of, I'm applying myself to these books, but really I'm kind of like taken off into dreamland. And you see a little watch there too, like he doesn't notice
time.
the time, sort of.
Doesn't notice the time.
You see references to the dream world or the ideal world in the Rider-Waite as well through the clouds.
Yes.
It isn't all the blue and the clouds. It's symbolizing more of an ideal realm, more of a spiritual higher ideal kind of scenario. So it does call back to that as well, but in a less, surface level kind of way.
I think it's interesting with it. I know we mentioned the fixed signs around the outside of the world as well, but it's kind of mocking the fixity in a sense. Like it's kind of like showing the wheel of samsara and the escape from it. And almost just like, no matter how fixed it is, or no matter how much
it's an idea.
Right.
Yeah. And in the middle, we have the Botticelli deck here, and this is depicting the birth of Venus, which I find very interesting because Venus finds her exaltation in this sign of Pisces, as well as Saturn finding its exaltation in Venus's sign of Libra. And so I feel like there's a little bit of a thing here.
It talks about the siren call that we were talking about earlier.
Yes.
But the Venus Urania, which is the one that rises from the sea foam, from the balls of Uranus, the Titan, she is born out of the sea foam generated from that. And she is the primordial thing that attracts us to keep going. Like it's kind of like the star card vibe. What?
The desire.
The desire. And it's kind of like the star card vibe, but I suppose that here we have a more conscious representation of it, where you're like,
she's trying to cover herself. She's trying to cover her nakedness, which is really interesting, I think, for Saturn. Whereas you might see images like the world and the star, and there's a couple of other, I think, I'm especially thinking of the Scapini deck when I'm thinking of this, that show naked women. And they don't seem to be covering themselves. So I think that this is a very interesting depiction of Venus on a Saturn card, covering herself. And also the relation to the sea is very prominent here as well.
Yeah.
As Venus was born from the sea foam, to be clear.
Yeah, and as you talk about like Saturn being exalted in Venus's sign of Libra, the air sign, or her now being exalted in Pisces, it's like Venus in some literature is shown to be sort of like, on one level, sort of like chaste or modest or pure or something. And I think that's maybe what we're getting at with this, is it's not like this open, free, like star card. It's like supposed to be like, oh, modest or chaste, or like that feminine idea of that. But, you know, the exaltation of Venus here, which we're actually going through right now in transit, where we have Venus in Pisces right now currently, which is the idea of if Venus is the lover of laughter, right? And she's the lover of pleasure. And she doesn't, yes, it's truth and it's beauty and it's law and it's justice and all these other ways. But if left to your own devices in Venus's world, it can be a little escapism vibes, because it's not necessarily dealing with like the day-to-day like crap of reality. It's very much like, how do we feel? And do we feel good? And are we relaxed?
Where's the dopamine hit? I need some dopamine.
And it's how relaxed we are. Are we compelled to just like laugh on a dime? Like if you think of someone who's laughter loving, like to be able to just sit around and like laugh at little things and stuff, you have to be generally pretty carefree. And so just the idea of like just pleasure loving or just relaxing or just enjoying or something like that shows Venus's exaltation and says something about like the Piscean archetype of just like, it's all good, it's water under the bridge, let's just, water under the bridge to me is like a Saturn Pisces thing of just like, let's not really go there, let's just let it be water under the bridge, let's just do our hike for today and like just have a good time or whatever. Kind of like not wanting to really deal with all that stuff that's in the oceanic undersurface.
Or turning all that stuff into beautiful art.
Absolutely,
into something expressive.
Absolutely, that too. Absolutely, yes. And I think, that part of it, to me, will develop through the Decan as well. And just the idea that Venus here exalted, like adds another boost to the feminine quality that we have of the water sign. So we've got the moon, and then we've got the water sign, and then we've got the Venus exaltation. So it does give a very sort of feminine, another drop in that bucket of the feminine mystery, I guess you could say, or the feminine beauty, the feminine wisdom, the archetype of the truth of the feminine sacred moment or sacred call.
Yeah, great point. I didn't explicitly make that connection, but if we're talking about the three-headed goddess with the moon, I mean, we better talk about Aphrodite here. So
yeah.
Before I move on to the Eight of Cups, I want to reference a section that T. Susan Chang has in her chapter on this Decan, where she shares a story of Odin, which I found freaking fascinating, and I think is really important to talk about throughout any cups. And I would definitely choose to talk about this earlier on in the Decanic journey had I understood this.
Right. And, I just wanted to mention, I think that's where we saw the hermit. Was the Odin story, right?
The Odin story, correct.
Yeah.
So we have Odin, who is a sort of Zeus figure in Nordic mythology. And just as in Greek mythology, there's kind of a collection of gods who are somewhat related, and they each rule over a different or multiple different kind of facets of the world. And there was one god named Mimir, who was the wisest of gods and had the knowledge of runes, of ancient runes, and the manipulation of this ancient language, which is really interesting. So in order to kind of not avenge Mimir, but when Mimir was killed, wanted to preserve that knowledge somehow. So his method of doing that was essentially to sacrifice or martyr himself by hanging upside down on a tree, which is very reminiscent of the Rider-Waite-Smith depiction of the hanged man, and essentially dying, but then being resurrected with this new magical knowledge of the runes. So the way that Chang kind of considers this is through the watery zodiacal majors of the quest, which is the searching for the knowledge, which is depicted by Cancer's card of the Chariot. And then we have the death. So this is after Odin has hanged himself upside down, but then pierced himself with a lance. It's a very gory situation. And that's death, or the card that we associate with the sign of Scorpio. And then finally, we have the mystic reward in the sign of Pisces, which is represented by the moon. So I want to read this little snippet of a piece from Havamal. And this is uttered by Odin after his 9 days of suspension underground. He says, "Then made fertile I was, and wise I became, waxed and did well. Very lunar.
Yeah, I wanted, that was, God, it's amazing. I have a little oak tree that I do some worship, not little, big, but oak is also Odin. And Odin is also kind of like omen, right? And so we've got this like deep kind of Odin thing. And just to, call in or invoke this Odin like oak like eminence for this Decanic story you just told. Odin was called the Wanderer, the hooded one, the masked
hermit. Yeah, exactly.
And the hooded one, I mean, yes, we have this looking like the hermit, we have it looking like the old man, but it's Saturn. It's Saturn. Saturn and Odin are the same sort of character. The Wanderer, the hooded one, the masked one, the feigned appearances, where he can show up as anyone at any time, but often shows up as a beggar or a one-eyed beggar or a cloaked beggar. This cloaked old man when he comes in his stories.
Old and impoverished is really,
yeah. And she mentioned also that Tolkien modeled his Gandalf character on Odin, which I didn't know, but he actually called him the Odinic or the Odinic Wanderer in his writings, and I thought that was really beautiful. So for those of you who want like a little image around it, think wise Gandalf style character for Odin. But I thought it was really interesting that she says here too, before we move past this T. Susan moment, that she says the dark night of the soul is an ordeal of purification and not torment. And so I think that's part of this kind of like hanged man Odin story. And she's saying it's a stripping away, which also reminds me of the baptism element or the star card, leaving behind what you once knew to gain something more precious. And she says it's an escape from, but also a journey toward, which I think is this kind of beautiful balance if you're just thinking, oh, escapism or whatever. And you get that when people do kind of cultivate the wisdom of these areas, of these liminal spaces, where like, yes, an ayahuasca journey could be an escape from, but it's also a journey towards.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to get out of the hangman. That's why we hang ourselves or go after these things anyways, is to sort of shake up the perspective and shake it out of you somehow, that the omenistic like element.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And, again, calling back to potentially theoretically, whatever Jesus's nativity in this Decan, you just have to notice how these themes, far beyond what we would consider the birth of Christ, far before then, these themes of resurrection, of martyrdom and resurrection are very present. And in fact, as I said, a Piscean archetype. So we need to recognize that when learning about Pisces.
Yeah, and if you go deep into it, you can say like that's even a part of the symbolism that attributed the birth here in the first place, was the omens around the meanings of the thing. That's why we would give the nativity to that place in the first place. So
absolutely.
The
eight of cups we have now. The Eight of Cups is the minor arcana card for this Decan. On the left, we have the most familiar probably depiction that you see in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. We see an eclipse happening, which is reminiscent of the moon card in the sky. We see somebody on a journey. But again, as we've referenced with the moon card kind of at length, there's an element of kind of feeling your way into this journey, using intuition to guide you. There's something dreamy about walking in the moonlight, even if it's an eclipse, especially if it's an eclipse, something very almost lucid dreaming like about feeling very subjective about your surroundings and everything being a mystery.
We see several rocks in the water, so treacherous waters, waters that are difficult or impossible to navigate. And we see that they're choosing a path there. They're in a red cloak, meaning there's passion. Again, the thing that I was mentioning with the bird from the Mother Peace deck. There's passion that's guiding this person. The staff is also there to represent that. But there's also some wisdom, I think, here that can be talked about in terms of the world card, in terms of you choose the path that is most appealing to you, like courageously, you know, without really trying to solve everything. This is one thing about the eights. Many times they're unsolvable puzzles. You just have to go with the flow. There's this mercurial quality to them.
Yeah, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with, if you want to process something, a checklist isn't going to work. You know, you're going to need to feel your way through it.
Yeah, and I also want to say, like, there could be a negative polarity here when I'm just reading from the Hermetic deck, just the straight 8 of Cups meaning, that just reminds me of like someone in constant search, but maybe searching for the wrong things, the Lord of Abandoned Success, right? Because it talks about temporary success. And what I think is interesting is it says, things thrown aside as soon as they're gained, nothing of lasting value, insolence in success. So the journey from place to place, searching for riches, but having instability. So it's kind of like, you know, the grass is always greener, but to your own type of peril. Like, yeah, you made this journey through the waters, and now you have this passion to search in the rocks, and now you have this passion to search in the night. And it's like, you keep wanting, and that's what the subconscious can do to us, right? And that's what some unhealthy patterns can do, is like this illusion of constantly searching for something so that we don't have to sort of sit in the discomfort, or we don't have to sit in the actual healing, or we don't have to, you know what I mean? Like that kind of searching energy. But here it's looked at as it's not necessarily successful. It's abandoned success. So it's beyond actually having success for the thing.
That's why we have the Lord of Indolence. That's why it's the Lord of like avoiding something, even if it is in the end a constructive journey or a good way for this person to figure it out. They must, in essence, leave something and not take action in the external world. This is a solitudinal card. The card on the far right is from the Art Nouveau deck. I don't show it terribly often because a lot of times it really mimics the Rider-Waite-Smith symbolism. But this one I thought was super cool because, again, it looks very much like the Hermit on his ascent into the mountains. And he too is carrying the staff and seems to have like orange tinted robes that might indicate a real passion and a real longing for finding the answers. But he's not taking action. He's just meditating upon the moon.
Right. And sometimes, again, we get this escapism vibe where it's like just for the escapism, or just for the journey, or just for the avoidant quality. But there is the possibility of the shift of perspective for the wisdom. Like, obviously, this is a treacherous path. You can see the path that he's taken leads straight to his fall or his demise, but he's willing to take these type of crazy risks in order to be endowed with the wisdom, because it's almost that treacherous. It's like, I would do anything to figure this out, or whatever. I would go to the far ends of the earth to figure this out, you know.
And the card's notably devoid of water, which is really interesting, given it is both the cups, the elemental water, and also the sign of Pisces that it finds its Decanic home in. But I think that that's really relevant somehow too, and something to consider. Maybe it's that the mountains are capped in snow, and that is the iteration of water that we're dealing with here. The lack of flowing, the lack of movement. This person's resting. So
that's what I got out of it. I got an icy landscape, a completely winter, like everything's covered in complete ice. I mean, it looks like winter,
which is what we find in the northern hemisphere a lot of times during this time of year. So
yeah, and it's what it's like. Again, it adds some extremeness, I guess, to this card, and some fixity also that you don't see in the other sort of like flowing water moon. It's like very isolated, very cold.
Absolutely.
And that's how someone can feel in their escapism and their desperation as well, of this like abandoned success. It's like if nothing else works, I'll abandon it all. I'll go to these icy perils just to ask the moon for her secrets or whatever.
That sounds so familiar. Oh, that's my journey. So escapism is really fun. In the middle, we have the science deck, which is beautiful. I freaking love this card. I think this might be one of my favorite cards in the whole of the science deck, just for the artwork, frankly, but also the meaning is beautiful. Cocoons clearly represent transformation. The caterpillar builds his cocoon and the butterfly bursts forth from it. But what we see here is kind of the period before bursting forth from it. And also, interestingly, this is the only card, I think, that we're seeing in this slide deck for this first decan of Pisces, where the moon is waxing. The moon is waxing here. It's heading towards full. And full, we would think, is when this butterfly will burst forth from the cocoon. But what's really important about the cocoon here is that in order for the caterpillar to transform, it must go through a period of isolation and protection and total retreat from the world.
Yeah. And complete trust, like it doesn't know why it's being compelled into the cocoon, really. And it has to be like, well, whatever, I just need this time for myself to rest or whatever it is, whatever's compelling me.
It's going to freshen up a little bit.
It could be even to their death. They don't know. Like they're just going into this cocoon. Also, I like these butterflies, how they look like little nighttime like fairies.
Yeah.
Like they look like, it reminds me of like Absinthe when they talk about like the green fairy or something like that.
Yeah. You can see like a really magical scene happening right here. It's beautiful.
You definitely feel like going into a cocoon after drinking absinthe. That's for sure.
Precisely.
After your 8 cups of whatever you want, you're ready for the cocoon for the night.
Okay, so this is another deck slide that I think I'm going to zoom in on a little bit because there's some super cool things here. The Mother Peace deck is on the left, where we have the 8 of Cups being represented by a squid. And this is a deep sea squid. It's so, I can't remember exactly when, but in our discussion before looking at the tarot cards, we were talking about the depths of the sea and the deep, deep waters and the mystery that we don't really know what's going on in the deepest parts of the sea. So that is what this squid represents. But also you see the sort of treasures of civilization, possibly like sunken treasures from a ship that the squid is holding. So there is a relatively optimistic vision here of, finding something very valuable at the depths of your subconscious considerations.
Yeah, and it's like when I think of the container, the vase, I think of the vessel, and I think of being able to contain or hold something or take something of that deep nature like with us, or providing a container for that space or something like that. That's how we would make anything from those deep sea journeys, being able to contain or hold those cups. Just the container is a spatial word, not necessarily like a vase per se.
Yeah.
Having a container in order to process the depths of the unconscious.
And how Saturnine to have boundaries and a thing in which
you can hold something in, a reference point at all for that deep space of underwater. Y'all get out and watch your underwater documentaries.
Seriously, or read some Soul of the Octopus or something for this decan.
Yeah, what's my octopus? Was it My Octopus Friend, or what's that one that was? It's somewhat recent.
Well, I that might be the Soul of the Octopus. Maybe.
Yeah, it might be. It's
the book that's kind of talking about the intelligence and the beautiful nature of that animal.
Yeah, I think there's a Netflix something where the person becomes friends with the octopus. It's like a documentary. Yeah, it's wild. So yeah, do your deep sea exploration right now, and the scape, the universe, the alien universe of the underwater nature that we have here, completely unexplored, still boggles my mind.
I know. Oh my God. The weirdest things you can possibly see that exist on the planet Earth. If you look a little bit about deep sea creatures, it's horrifying. They might as well be aliens. So, but also inspiring, I should say, not that.
And it's this earthly landscape
Growth.
that's unexplored and completely alien to us, but yet an earthly landscape that we're just not willing to go explore for whatever reason, or it's
Because
wild.
it scares us.
Yeah, it's not financially, promising. So
Yeah, the only reason why they want to get to the seabed is to see if they can like drill for oil down there or whatever.
Basically, yes. No, that's absolutely. I feel like that's something.
But that could be a metaphor for our own crap too.
Yeah,
also,
that's
it's
what
like
I'm
we don't
saying.
want to go into the unconscious unless we're absolutely forced to get something out of it or whatever.
Right. We want to find treasure, or else what's the point? But let that be a lesson. There is something valuable probably to be found there. So the Eight of Cups in the Scapini deck is like super detailed. And so I'm going to try to do it justice without describing every single one of the cups. But in the middle, we have a picture of a woman and her knight in shining armor, embracing and kissing. And it's kind of like a fantasy. It's kind of like something that would be a hope or a dream. And then surrounding it are 8 cups, which don't necessarily all support that vision of dreaming and of a fantasy. So some of the cups include things like up here, a puppet theater, which I think has a pretty clear symbolistic meaning. Like, is there somebody that's acting as a puppet here? Are they being manipulated in some way? We have this woman with a spider and a spider web, which
she's locked up.
Yeah. Oh, she's what?
She's locked up. She's in jail or something.
Right here? Oh, right next to.
Doesn't it seem like bars, shadows on her body?
Oh,
yeah, you kind of can, or it gives maybe that, like I saw at first, like she's being frightened completely by the spider, but it does, like at the top, you can sort of like see a window or a bar, like almost like you're caught in the web or trapped or in prison.
Exactly. That's That's how I would interpret it. Spiders in some traditions are considered lucky, but in this not. In this depiction, it's not necessarily lucky. It's being frightened by something, and potentially disappointment and fear. One would potentially fear coming across a spider, and that's something that this character's.
I won.
We have an eagle here who's carrying a frog, which is very interesting animal symbolism that I actually had to go back and look up. I know eagles, eagles clearly independence, sometimes like royalty, bravery, items like this, but clutching a frog, I wasn't totally sure what that meant. A frog could be a symbol of elemental water, but a frog is also considered somewhat lucky, but very much attached to material concerns. And so this eagle gripping this frog is essentially like kind of taking control of the situation and enforcing its will on the frog. So it's almost like what I'm trying to get to the point of here with describing some of these various cards is the possibilities ahead of this knight in shining armor and the damsel in distress. So it could be that the eagle clutching a frog, which seems like a fairly positive omen, would be her going forth and achieving what they want. The puppet theater could be that there is some deception happening. There could be somebody lying to the other. The spider could be that she finds disappointment and isn't able to fully enjoy the romance. But what this is all pointing to is, just as we said, like you need to go with the flow sometimes, and you don't know how it's going to turn out. So while all these opportunities, both hopes and fears, appear in front of you, there's almost like a exist in the present moment type lesson.
Yeah, and almost, like it's contained all of her hopes and fears, and they're probably all alive in whatever
is happening right there.
Yeah, like whatever, it is all of her hopes and fears kind of coming to that one moment of idealizing that relationship, let's say, or idealizing her knight in shining armor, or he, her, or whatever it is. Because you also see like the demon speaking and the imprisonment themes and the isolation themes of being alone, and like, just looking into that subconscious of like why we bond with someone, or kind of the guilt also we see like someone confessing or whatever. So it's just like all of our hopes and fears are compiled into this one thing when we think that we meet our knight in shining armor, our damsel in distress. So it's like those kind of things all come to the surface, and how much of them are real, I don't know, but how much of them will manifest through our emotional connection with this person, probably all of them, on both sides of the coin,
over time. Yes. Especially
over time with the Saturn thing. So this I know, I was like, oh my god, this 8 of Cups is packed.
It's packed.
Wild.
It's so intense. So
and if you think of abandoned success, like you can imagine he or her having success and abandoning it for their love union, let's say, like for whatever reason or something like that, like he has this knightly whatever, she has her chaste or something like this, and they sort of throw it all to the wind as soon as they like meet their love with like hopes of desire of a better future, or upon their fears or whatever it is,
Absolutely.
So it's again kind of that escapism of like, it doesn't matter what our fears or desires or our successes have been, we're willing to like throw caution to the wind for whatever purpose of like escapism, which a lot of people do when it comes to like love and psyche,
Yes, it's very easy to do because it is in fact a drug that we're experiencing when we experience love and lust. It is
don't
a drug.
Say love can have an addictive quality. Don't say. So and again, abandoning that success for whatever hopes and dreams and visions you have, and it could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like but in a lot of cases it's more toxic, like Austin said. In a lot of cases you see more madmen than whatever prophets, or what, I forget how he put it, but something like that, where it's like we're so willing to abandon our successes when something comes along that either triggers our hopes or our fears or our subconscious, like everything goes, we're marrying them or whatever it is, so
Walk Away, Vanessa Hudgens, High School Musical 3. I recommend it. It starts playing in the background right now.
And to our own peril most of the time when we're doing any kind of escapism. And love and connection is a human thing that we need, and emotionality is a human thing that we need. But when we're willing to abandon it all because of hopes or fears, I think that's a caution here. That's Venus's exaltation here too, that we could caution.
But again, I'm looking forward to a lot of robust discussions about the moon card. It's actually a really rich card as well in symbolism. So we have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing those again and for your displays with the cards. It's helped people so much follow along. So everyone clap for KD, round of applause for bringing those. And for all of us, like give us a little round of applause in the chat. Give us some hands, give us some claps. We are here at Pisces. So thank you all for tuning in for this. And thank you both for everything you brought thus far in the journey. I really appreciate you both. So we're not ending. We still have Pisces to go, but it is sort of feeling like, the moon card is in conclusion. And, moon has a lot to do with memory and recall of the past and kind of nostalgia. So I'm definitely there in this like universe moon card moment.
And speaking of memory, I think we should go to some nativities that have already left us, but that continue to be icons in our imagination, like Alan Rickman, for instance, or Steve Jobs, for better or worse. And
I should have worn my black turtleneck today.
Elizabeth Taylor.
Kurt Cobain, I feel like, was a really good one. So I want to go back to that. We should definitely just mention Kurt Cobain. He is somebody that when I was first learning astrology when I was a teenager was like my example of a Pisces man.
Oh, for sure. And you see all of that, like the passionate escapism, the abandoning of success, because that was the whole punk rock movement is the abandoning of success, and very Saturnine, right? Being in like tattered black clothes and da. So like his rise to fame was very Saturnine, but very Piscean, like ridiculously imaginative, and it built on like a heroin chic, like escapism, like principle or whatever. So very much that whole punk rock heroin chic vibe is very Saturn and Pisces, which he's sort of the head of, like the kind of icon of that vibe, that movement. And Steve Jobs, I think, is really interesting as well because, you know, not only was he known for like wearing the same thing all the time, which I think is kind of interesting, that like Saturnine fixity or whatever, of not having to make a decision because you have too many decisions to make, but also about like, he wasn't necessarily the brains of the details of how to get everything done. He's like, I just know like what I want to ultimately happen and what I want to ultimately feel.
He was
right?
a visionary.
Yes.
Visionary.
And also he abandoned successes a lot.
Yes.
In his, you know, story line.
We also have now I think not dead people anymore. Rihanna. Unless something's changed. Drew Barrymore, who's, you know, interesting.
Did we also do? I mean, her story is very much Pisces
Fascinating.
Saturn, and very,
Fascinating.
very Pisces Saturn. If you go into her tragic kind of like story, you think of her as like this bubbly, charismatic, like
Yeah, it
actress,
doesn't end
but-
up tragic. Her journey resulted in her arriving at a pretty cool place for her.
But it was also full of torment, abuse,
Full of
addiction, and things
Exactly.
like this, and like just being, you know, taken advantage of as a child star and all of these things. But even that, if you don't know anything about Drew Barrymore, you see her as kind of this like bubbly actress or whatever, and you would, unless you know her history, you wouldn't see it as so Saturnian and so terrible. You see her as this like positive, like going with the flow kind of like actress.
Like George Washington, if you look at him as, you know, the father of the nation, you kind of miss all the shit that he was doing in the background.
Yep.
Right. I was going to say back to our dead, you know, like we didn't go like linear through dead and alive, but yeah, George Washington being sort of this epitome of like, you know, the ideal, but being a corrupted ideal.
He totally hung on to the ideal of not wanting a monarchy in the US, and he was willing to go through peaceful transitions of power in order to preserve this vision of a country that wasn't ruled by a monarchy. However, all of his decisions were actually about commercial success and about the ability to make money off of slaves.
And to the Rihanna point, I mean, I love Rihanna, and, you know, congratulations on your baby, Rihanna. But then in that music field of people that are like, you know, just musically, I guess we have in our dead or past celebrities, we've got Johnny Cash and George Harrison, and they're very different, but at the same time, they both have this man in black kind of character that, you know, Johnny sort of characterized, but I'm putting on to George Harrison, I guess, but also this liminal, this liminal like experience of both being like very serious, which is that kind of Saturn thing, but also in George Harrison case, very creative and very like spiritual,
yeah.
But also like the shy one, right? The one that's like back or reserved, which you get with Kurt Cobain as well. Like you get that kind of mysterious kind of like retreat from the spotlight.
You know, there's another nativity here of a guy who was really mysterious, someone who could, you know, sneak up on you like nobody else. The Night Stalker.
All right. Yes, Richard Ramirez. So if anybody's into true crime, we had, you know, I think there's a doc or a movie or something out about the Night Stalker, so you could watch that if you're into that type of thing, but otherwise, big disclaimer.
There's a movie, there's a series. Before that, there's a bunch of news articles, dead bodies, and all that shit.
Right.
But yeah, the Night Stalker. How perfect is that?
Yeah, but yeah, that exactly. Like the name that they give him is the Night Stalker, and that's very much the image that we see in the moon card or the 8 of just this like person lurking in the moonlight and the shadowy like thing, or that kind of like potentially obsessive quality. So we've got the Night Stalker.
Well, the Night Stalker was more than a killer on the loose. He was an ideal, you know, that caught on to the social awareness of that time in that place in particular.
Lots of women showed up to his trial and were in love with him.
And there are many people who were scared as shit about the whole situation and that would try to protect their homes, that would be, you know, really paranoid about their children for months and months or years. I don't know how long that went exactly now off the top of my head. But Yeah, nice
People
talking.
romanticized him though. Like at the
Well,
same time that he
yes.
struck fear in the heart of the whole community, there were people around the world who formed like fan clubs for
But
this
you have
freaking
to know
serial
that
killer.
that
He's
happens
still
with
depicted in
these,
the media as a character.
No, right.
but that
He's
happens
commercialized.
with these commercialized killers, right? We are obsessed with true crime, and you get these, and this, the reason why I'm bringing this sort of up is this is the Lord of abandoned success, right? So you have these people like abandoning the classic success and like being in love with like someone who they know is a serial killer because it treads the lines of those deep unconscious or whatever. Like because of that, they become sort of fascinated. He's not the only or the first one that women thought were like
No.
hot, and you know, like you got Manson and whatever that other guy was that was like hot and got all the college women or whatever. Everyone thought he was so charismatic and so whatever, because that's that sort of subconscious glorification or whatever, you know, of like not really dealing with their subconscious but thinking it's so hot, the fact that you could be like this terrible killer person or whatever. So I think that whole being obsessed with true crime and like that abandoned success for like an abuser or something like that is very much, you know, highlighted with the Night Stalker vibe or that kind of true crime obsession. Okay, so Galileo, Figaro, exploring. I mean,
visionary. He had faith, I think, in especially those days. You had to have a strong conviction that there was a pattern to the universe, and a strong conviction in what you felt was.
He was forced to negate several of his convictions.
His religious convictions, yeah.
Not only that, wasn't he the one who was threatened to be arrested by the church if he didn't say that what he was saying was a lie?
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, he was forced to abandon those convictions, but I think that changed his convictions about religion, from what I understand.
Oh, no, yeah, totally. Yeah. I'm not saying that he abandoned it, but I'm just saying about the Saturnian image that we have here, like someone who had the knowledge that was needed but was not wanted, you know?
Yeah.
And again, religiosity and faith and the questioning of that faith or the pressure of abandoning that faith or whatever that kind
being
of
a martyr for science.
Well, that being said, thank you guys for doing nativities and staying till the end. If you like this content or find it valuable, you can comment down below. Let us know where you're coming in from. Also, like, subscribe if you haven't already, or let other astrologer friends know that this is a up-and-coming astrology channel that we can learn from and share and grow together. So we definitely love your input, whether it's confirming or denying our, what we've brought forth. And please feel free to bring forth your own observations about these decans as we go. I think we are moving to the conclusion of this decan, a Pisces I. One thing that we could close with from T. Susan Chang that I thought was really cool and beautiful, and maybe some of you Pisces might resonate with, or at least I did for this decan. So she said, let go of the fear that anything could happen and open up to wonder and awe that indeed anything could happen.
Beautiful.
Okay. Do you want to bring us out with the poem, baby?
Definitely. So at the end of the chapter, this poem is from Havamal, which is translated by W.H. Auden and P.B. Taylor. It's something of a mythological story about Odin and the myth that we mentioned earlier. And apologies if I mispronounce any of the Norse gods or figures' names. Wounded, I hung on windswept gallows for 9 long nights, pierced by a spear, pledged to Odin, offered myself to myself. The wisest know not from whence spring the roots of that ancient rood. They gave me no bread, they gave me no mead. I looked down, with a loud cry, I took up the runes from the tree I fell. 9 lays of power. I learned from the famous Boltar, Bestla's father. He poured me a draught of precious mead, mixed with magic odorer. Waxed and throve well. Word from word gave words to me. Deed from deed gave deeds to me. Runes you will find, and readable staves, very strong staves, very stout staves, staves that both are stained, made by mighty powers, graven by the prophetic god. For the gods by Odin, for the elves by Dane, by Dwalin too for the dwarves, by Asvid for the hateful giants, and some I carved myself. Tund, before man was made, scratched them. Who rose first, fell thereafter. Know how to cut them, know how to read them, know how to stain them, know how to prove them, know how to evoke them, know how to score them, know how to send them, know how to destroy them.
Matao kako sama yo na bekana soba da soba kena mataiba nako di ma na bekana soba and soba ataiba na ke ujuno ba ikana kamaya da onga ija Your Majesty, Mataibe kana sabaso Indakina Tabaine To your guys Imbayatoma Tabaike Tiona Makano Yoga Sono me yabagorina Gamoyana goyimi On my way go by Tiona Makano Yoga Sono me yabagorina